She was declared dead in 1962. She was buried, mourned, forgotten. She came back in 1974. When they lower a casket into the ground, when you've stood at the graveside, when you've read the name on the stone, when you've watched the dirt go over, you make an assumption. You assume the story ends there. Most of the time, it does. But every once in a while, not often, not usually, the story doesn't end. It waits. In 1974, a woman knocked on the door of an English estate. The man who answered had been married to her once. He had also, according to every official document in existence, been her widower for the past 12 years. She was not a ghost. She was not a rumor. She was very much alive. And she had questions. What happened next? What he had done? What she had arranged? And what the system did when it finally found out is one of the strangest, most quietly devastating stories I have ever found in a British archive. Stay with me, because nothing about this is what it looks like. And the twist, the real one, the one that reframes everything, doesn't come until the very end. It's worth the wait, I promise. Before we go any further, before we pull back the curtain on what really happened inside that estate, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We genuinely love hearing from our community, and it means more than you know. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We've got stories coming that will absolutely floor you. Now, let's go back to the beginning. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Edward Harlan Ashford, the Duke of Carleton. And if you had passed him on the street in London in 1951, you would have noticed him immediately. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because men like Edward Ashford carried the particular gravity of someone who had never once in his life needed to announce himself. He was the kind of man that rooms rearranged themselves around. Tall, measured in speech, educated at the finest institutions England had to offer, heir to an estate that had sat in the Ashford family for over 200 years. He wore his title the way certain men wear a perfectly cut coat, like it had simply always been there, like it would be unthinkable to imagine him without it. He was, by every visible measure, the definition of a man who had everything in its right place. But the most dangerous thing about Edward Ashford, the thing that would eventually unravel the entire careful architecture of his life, was this. He was a man who believed, with absolute and unshakable conviction, that the correct arrangement of appearances was the same thing as the truth. That belief was not born in him, it was built. His father, William Harlan Ashford, had run the dukedom the way a general runs a military campaign, with discipline, with hierarchy, and with the firm understanding that what the world saw was the only version of reality that mattered. The estate's finances could be struggling. The marriages could be hollow. The relationships between family members could be barely held together with obligation and silence. None of that was relevant as long as the right face was presented at the right function on the right evening. Edward watched his father operate this way for the first 20 years of his life, and what he absorbed, what settled into the marrow of him, was not warmth, not intimacy, but competence, the management of situations, the solving of problems before they became visible. He was exceptionally good at it. That competence, wielded by a man with a title and money, and the protection of a system that had always looked after men exactly like him, would turn out to be the most destructive force in the lives of 3 women. And one of those women was named Eleanor. Eleanor Grace Whitfield was 26 years old when she first met Edward Ashford at a dinner party in the winter of 1949. She was not from his world, not in the way that world measured these things. Her father was a well-regarded professor of literature at the University of Edinburgh. Her mother a music teacher with a dry sense of humor and strong opinions about character. Eleanor had grown up surrounded by books and ideas, and the particular kind of conversation that happens in houses where the furniture is comfortable but not expensive, where the guests are interesting but not necessarily influential. She was, by every account of those who knew her in those years, luminously alive in rooms. She had a quality that is genuinely rare. the ability to make the person she was speaking to feel as though they were the most interesting person present, not because she flattered them, but because she was genuinely, constitutionally curious about people. She wanted to know what they thought and why they thought it, and she had the patience and the intelligence to listen to the answer. Edward Ashford had never encountered anything quite like her. In the world he had grown up in, women were accomplished in particular prescribed ways. They were beautiful or elegant or socially connected. They were assets to a household or they were problems to be managed. Eleanor was neither. She was simply, and this is the only word that fits, present in a way that made everything else in the room feel slightly less real by comparison. He fell for her in the way that men who have spent their whole lives behind carefully constructed walls sometimes fall, suddenly and without his permission. He was not a man who expressed feeling easily. He had been trained out of it too thoroughly and for too long. But those who were present in the early months of 1950, who watched Edward Ashford at the functions and gatherings where Eleanor also appeared, later said there was something unmistakable in the way he watched her across a room. Not possessive, not calculating, just watching. The way a man watches something he cannot quite believe is real. They were engaged by the summer of 1950 and married in a quiet ceremony in the spring of 1951. His family was not entirely pleased. Eleanor was not the match they would have chosen. She had no title, no great fortune, no network of aristocratic connections to bring into the family. But Edward, for the first and perhaps only time in his life, held firm. He wanted Eleanor Whitfield, and for a brief, luminous period of years, the marriage was exactly what it appeared to be, something real in a life that had always been mostly performance. They were happy. That matters. It matters because the story that follows is so dark that it is easy, in retrospect, to project that darkness backward, to assume the marriage was always hollow, always doomed, always a lie. It was not. The letters from those early years, discovered decades later in an archive box that no one had opened in 40 years, tell a different story. They tell the story of two people who argued about books and laughed at the same things and stayed up too late talking about subjects that had nothing to do with the estate or the title or the responsibilities that would come later. Edward wrote to Eleanor when he traveled. He described things he saw, a market in France, a cathedral in Spain, with a specificity and an affection that you do not put into letters you write out of obligation. And Eleanor wrote back with the kind of warmth that is not performance. Whatever happened later, and we will get to exactly what happened later, the first 4 or 5 years of that marriage were genuine. And that genuineness is what makes what came next so impossibly sad. Because somewhere around 1956, the marriage began to change. Not dramatically, not with a single rupture that could be pointed to and named. It changed the way important things often change, gradually and then all at once. The estate's finances, which had always been complicated, became genuinely difficult. A series of bad investments, a property deal that did not go as planned, and the weight of maintaining a 200-year-old estate on an income that had not kept pace with the cost of keeping the thing standing. All of it began to press down on Edward in ways that he could not discuss with Eleanor, because discussing it would have meant admitting that the arrangement was in trouble, and admitting that the arrangement was in trouble was the one thing Edward Ashford was constitutionally incapable of doing. So instead he became withdrawn, formal. The warmth that had surprised everyone who knew him when he was with Eleanor slowly retreated behind the old professional distance. The letters stopped being frequent. The conversations became about logistics. And Eleanor, who had chosen him precisely because she believed she had found the man behind the title, began to grieve the loss of something she could not quite name, because technically nothing had been taken from her. Technically, she was still the Duchess of Carleton. Technically, the marriage was intact. But the man she had married was retreating, room by room, back behind the walls he had been building his whole life, and she did not know how to follow him there. And then, in 1958, Eleanor became ill. The illness was real. It was serious. A diagnosis that the doctors delivered in the careful, measured language that doctors used in that era when they were trying to say something terrible without quite saying it directly. She was given in the most optimistic reading of the prognosis, perhaps 2 to 3 years. In the least optimistic reading, considerably less. The illness was not immediately visible. She did not lose her appearance or her energy right away. But the weight of knowing was there, behind her eyes, in the slight pause before she answered questions, in the way she began to look at rooms and people and conversations as though she was memorizing them. Edward was told. He received the news in the manner of a man receiving intelligence about a military situation, processing it, calculating its implications, filing it away. He did not fall apart. He did not weep. Those who were present in that meeting with the physician described him afterward as very still, composed, already somewhere behind the surface, beginning to plan. What happened next is where the...
Eleanor, the results are back. I'm afraid it's not good news.
How bad is it?
The illness is advanced. We need to discuss treatment.
I see.
Trying to decide what name to give it, because in the months that followed Eleanor's diagnosis, Edward Ashford began a relationship with a woman named Catherine Moore, and not a secret, hidden, guilty relationship of the kind that powerful men had always conducted in the shadows of their public lives. Something more structured than that, something that, from the evidence that survived, looks less like an affair and more like a plan. Catherine Moore was 31 years old in 1958. She came from a family of considerable means. Her father was a prominent banker with connections across the British financial establishment. And the Moore family name was precisely the kind of name that opened doors in the circles where the Ashford dukedom needed doors to open. She was presented socially as a friend of the family, then as a close acquaintance, then in the careful, incremental way that Edward Ashford managed everything. As simply someone who was frequently present, she was elegant and self-possessed, and she understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone would later admit, the nature of the arrangement being constructed around her. She was not a naive woman. She was not swept off her feet by a man she did not understand. Catherine Moore was, by every account, fully aware of the terrain, and she stepped onto it deliberately and with open eyes. What she did not know, what no one told her, what she would not discover for 12 years, was that the terrain had a fault line running directly through its center. Because by 1959, while Eleanor was still alive, still living at the estate, still technically and legally the Duchess of Carleton, Edward Ashford had begun making arrangements. That word, arrangements, will appear again and again in this story, and every time it does, I want you to listen to it carefully, because it is doing an enormous amount of work. Arrangements is the word that powerful men and their solicitors use when they mean something that cannot be spoken plainly. Arrangements is the word that covers the space between what is legal and what is right, between what the law permits and what a decent human being would choose. Edward Ashford was making arrangements, and the key figure in those arrangements was a man named Robert Croft, the Ashford family's solicitor of 15 years, a meticulous, discreet, and extraordinarily loyal professional who had spent the better part of his career ensuring that the Ashford estate's complications remained exactly that, complications rather than catastrophes. It was Robert Croft who first raised the legal framework that would shape everything that followed. Under English law at the time, if a spouse had been absent and unheard from for a period of 7 years, they could be presumed dead. But Eleanor was not absent. Eleanor was very much present, living in the east wing of the same house. For the arrangement to work, for Edward Ashford to be free to marry Catherine Moore with any legal standing whatsoever, Eleanor had to actually disappear, or had to appear to have died. And the question of which of those two things actually happened is the question that would take 12 years, a junior clerk with a stubborn disposition, and a coastal hotel register to begin to answer. What we know from the documentary record, from the financial accounts that survived, from the testimony that eventually emerged piece by careful piece, is this. In the spring of 1962, Eleanor Grace Ashford ceased to exist, officially. A death certificate was filed, signed by Robert Croft as a witness, citing a respiratory illness as the cause of death. There was a private burial, no public service, no announcement in the newspapers that would have been customary for the death of a duchess, No formal notification to the broader social circle that Eleanor had moved through during her years at the estate. And Edward communicated the news to a small number of people directly and personally. He was, by all accounts, appropriately grieving, composed but sorrowful. The estate staff were told that the Duchess had passed quietly. A small headstone was erected in the family's private cemetery on the grounds. Everything was done correctly. Everything was in its proper place, and within the year the estate began to move forward, as Edward Ashford had always believed estates should, without sentiment, without delay, and without the complications of the past cluttering the path of the future. In March of 1963, Edward Ashford married Catherine Moore in a ceremony that was, unlike his first wedding, conducted with full social fanfare. The photographs appeared in the society pages, and the guest list was everything a guest list at a duke's wedding was supposed to be: connections, titles, money, influence. Catherine wore a dress that was discussed at length in the pages that covered such things. Edward stood beside her in the photographs with the expression of a man fulfilling an obligation with appropriate grace. Not joyful exactly, but correct. Always with Edward Ashford, correct. The marriage was celebrated. The new Duchess of Carleton took her place at the estate's functions and her seat at its dinner table and her role in its social life. And the name Eleanor was not spoken again. Not in public, not in the correspondence that survived, not in the accounts of anyone who was present in the household in those years. Eleanor Grace Ashford, the woman who had made Edward Ashford laugh in country house photographs, nay, the woman who had written him letters full of life and curiosity and genuine warmth, was gone, filed, arranged away, except she was not gone, not even slightly. Eleanor Grace Ashford was living, as it would eventually be discovered, in a town on the Cornish coast called Marazion, a small, windswept place that sits at the edge of the Atlantic and looks out across the water towards St. Michael's Mount. She was living there under the name Eleanor Gray. She had a small house, a modest garden that she tended with evident care, a cat whose name we do not know, a local library where she was a familiar and apparently much liked presence, and a doctor who knew her medical history and who had, in the extraordinary silence that surrounds this entire story, apparently kept it to himself. She painted watercolors. She read voraciously. She corresponded with her sister Margaret in Edinburgh, in letters whose content was carefully managed to reveal nothing that could not be published in a newspaper, but whose existence alone, had anyone been tracking the postal routes, would have told them everything they needed to know. Eleanor Ashford was not in hiding the way a frightened person hides. She was in hiding the way a woman hides who has decided, with great clarity and great deliberateness, that the life she has constructed for herself is worth protecting. She was, by the account of the people in Marazion, who would eventually be interviewed, years later, after everything came out, a quiet and private, but by no means unhappy person. She walked on the beach in the mornings. She knew the names of the fishermen. Once she celebrated Christmas with the family of a neighbor who had become a genuine friend. She was, in other words, living, fully, in a way that the life she had left behind, the estate, the title, the performance of being a duchess for a man who had retreated so completely behind his own walls that she could no longer find him, had not permitted. And here is the question that hangs over everything I have just told you. The question that has no clean answer. The question I want to sit with you for a moment before we move forward. Was Eleanor a victim? Was she wronged? The obvious answer, the answer that a headline would give you, is yes. Her husband had arranged her disappearance, had her death falsely certified, had married another woman, had erased her name and her existence from the record of his life. Yes, she was wronged. By any reasonable measure, yes. But there is another question underneath that one, and it is harder. Did Eleanor consent to this? Did she choose it? And the answer to that question is the thing that makes this story so much more complicated than it first appears. Because the evidence that would take until 2003 to fully surface, suggests that the truth is not a simple story of a victim and a perpetrator. The truth is something far more human and far more devastating than that. But we are not there yet. We have to get to 1974 first. We have to get to the moment when a junior accounts clerk named Thomas Garfield, working in the offices of a land management firm in Bristol that handled, among other things, the financial administration of a number of private trusts across the southwest of England, pulled a file from a cabinet on a Tuesday afternoon in October and found something that did not make sense. He was not, by his own later admission, a dramatic man. He was thorough, methodical, and possessed of the particular kind of quiet stubbornness that makes for either a very good accountant or a very irritating one, depending on whether or not you want everything to add up. What Thomas Garfield found in that file was a trust, a modest but regular income payment being dispersed quarterly to a named beneficiary at an address in Marazion, Cornwall. The beneficiary's name was Eleanor Gray. The trust had been established in 1962 by the Ashford family estate, administered quietly through a third-party financial intermediary, and had been paying out without interruption or incident for 12 years. Thomas Garfield noted that he could find no living person by the name of Eleanor Gray registered anywhere in the estate's formal records. He flagged it. His supervisor told him it was likely an old arrangement and to leave it alone. Thomas Garfield noted his supervisor's response in writing, waited 2 weeks, and flagged it again. And then, because he was exactly the kind of man who could not let a column that did not balance simply be left not balancing, he did something that would bring the entire architecture of the last 12 years crashing down around the Ashford estate like a condemned wall. He wrote a letter to the estate's solicitors asking them to formally confirm the identity and living status of the trust beneficiary. The response he received was evasive in a way that, to anyone who knew how to read legal language, it was not evasive at all. It was, in fact, a very clear signal that something was wrong. The letter did not deny, it did not confirm, it redirected. It suggested that the matter was the subject of a long-standing private family arrangement, and that further inquiry should be directed to the estate directly. Thomas Garfield, to his eternal credit, directed further inquiry to the estate directly, and then to the county registry. And then, when those inquiries produced no satisfying resolution, he did the thing that Robert Croft had spent 12 years ensuring no one would think to do. He wrote directly to the address in Marazion, and Eleanor Gray, Eleanor Grace Ashford, as she had been born, as she had been married, wrote back. The letter she sent was brief and remarkably composed for a communication that had the potential to collapse an entire world. She confirmed that she was alive. She confirmed her identity. She thanked Thomas Garfield for his persistence in a way that suggested she had perhaps always known, at some level, that the arrangement would eventually surface. That arrangements, no matter how carefully constructed, have the peculiar habit of unraveling from the smallest loose thread. And she asked him, with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 12 years rebuilding her own understanding of what she was owed and what she was willing to claim, to please not proceed further without allowing her to be informed of each step. She was not panicked. She was not frantic. She was precise. And that precision, that unshakable, a almost eerie composure in the face of the storm she knew was about to break, is the first thing that tells you everything important about who Eleanor Ashford actually was. News reached Edward Ashford in November of 1974. The account of who told him and exactly how varies depending on the source. But what is consistent across every version is this. He was sitting in the library of the estate when it happened. He had a glass of whiskey on the table beside him, and a book open in his lap, and the fire going, the way he spent most of his evenings in those years. And Robert Croft, aging now, and not in good health, the weight of what he had helped construct, clearly visible in the manner of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, came into the room and told him. And Edward Ashford set the book down, closed it. Ward picked up the whiskey, took a long, slow drink, and said nothing for a period of time that Robert Croft would later describe in his own private journal, discovered after his death, as the most uncomfortable silence of his professional life. What Edward Ashford said when he finally spoke was this: how did they find the trust? 4 words that told Robert Croft, and that would later tell everyone who read the account, exactly the shape of the man's mind. Not. Is she well? Not. My God. Not any of the things that a person might say upon learning that their first wife, whom they had certified as dead 12 years ago, was in fact alive and well and had been painting watercolors in Cornwall for over a decade. No. How did they find the trust? Find the Nukram, because even in that moment, even in the first seconds of understanding that the architecture was coming down, Edward Ashford's first instinct was to understand the structural failure, to identify the weakness in the arrangement, to find the point at which the management had broken down. Catherine More Ashford, Catherine, the second Duchess of Carleton, the woman who had married Edward in 1963 in the full public ceremony with the society page photographs and the guest list of titles and connections, was informed 3 days later. That gap, those 3 days, matters. Edward needed 3 days before he could tell his current wife that she might not legally be his wife. 3 days to speak to lawyers. 3 days to understand what exposure looked like. 3 days to begin, already, the process of managing the situation before managing the woman. When Catherine was finally told, she received the information in the sitting room of the East Wing, the same wing where Eleanor had lived before she disappeared, sitting in a chair that she had chosen herself when she had redecorated the room after taking up residence in the estate. The woman who delivered the news was a family solicitor, not Robert Croft, who by this point had been quietly retired from the matter, a younger partner from the firm who had the deeply uncomfortable assignment of explaining to a 61-year-old woman that her marriage of 11 years was, under the law, a legal impossibility. Catherine Ashford did not make a scene. She did not raise her voice. And she sat in the chair she had chosen for that room, and she looked at the solicitor, and she looked at the wall, and she looked at the fire, and she was very, very still. And then she said, "And this is drawn from the solicitor's own account, written up in the firm's private case notes and later submitted as part of the legal proceedings. How long has she been alive?" And when the solicitor told her 12 years, Catherine Ashford stood up from the chair, excused herself, went upstairs, and did not come back down for the rest of that day. What happened in the rooms of the East Wing in the hours that followed is not recorded. But the housekeeper who was present in the house that evening, a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Pilton, who had worked at the estate for 22 years, and who was, by every account, the kind of institutional memory that great houses depend on to function, said only when interviewed years later that she had never heard the house so quiet. Not even during the official mourning period for Eleanor in 1962. Not even then. The legal process that followed was, in the manner of all things involving the British aristocracy and its relationship with embarrassing truth, conducted with a maximum of discretion and a minimum of public accountability. Edward Ashford's solicitors made the argument, and this is the part of the story where I need you to sit with your reaction, because your reaction is the right one. They made the argument that Eleanor had consented to the arrangement, that she had been a willing participant in her own disappearance, that the death certificate, also while technically a legal document of questionable accuracy, had been a mutually agreed upon administrative solution to a situation that both parties had wished to resolve. The argument was legally creative in the way that only very expensive lawyers can be legally creative. It was also, if you read it carefully, a confession dressed up as a defense, because the only way to argue that Eleanor had consented to the arrangement is to acknowledge that there was an arrangement. And the only way to acknowledge that there was an arrangement is to acknowledge that Edward Ashford had known, at the time of his second marriage, that his first wife was alive, which is, by any definition of the word, bigamy. The law, confronted with this, did what the law does when it is uncomfortable. It moved slowly. The case was examined. Opinions were sought. The Church of England, which had blessed the second marriage in a ceremony conducted by a bishop who was a personal friend of the Ashford family, was quietly consulted. Various institutions that should have had sharp, clear answers found upon reflection that the answers were perhaps not quite as sharp or as clear as one might initially have supposed. And in the meantime, Eleanor, who was now 72 years old, and who had been living quietly in Marazion for 12 years and who had rebuilt her entire sense of herself around the life she had made there, had to decide what she wanted, what she would ask for, whether she would press for justice or for privacy, or for something else entirely. Something that no one who was building their legal strategy around her expected. Because Eleanor Ashford did not want what everyone assumed she would want. She did not want a prosecution. She did not want Edward Ashford charged and tried and dragged through a public proceeding in which the details of their marriage and her illness and her disappearance would be laid out in a courtroom for journalists to pick through and shape into whatever narrative served the front page. She did not want that for herself, and, in a complexity that the legal system had no category for, she did not entirely want it for Edward either. What Eleanor wanted, as she stated in a formal written submission to the court that has since become, for those who have read it, one of the most remarkable documents to emerge from any English legal proceeding of that era, was two things. First, the formal legal reinstatement of her existence. She wanted to exist again, officially, as a person in the eyes of the state. Not for financial reasons, not as a precondition for any claim against the estate, simply because she had spent 12 years technically dead, and she wanted, before she died actually, to exist on paper in the country she had lived her whole life in. Second, she wanted the court to understand, and she was precise about this, careful about this, almost lawyerly in the way she constructed this part of her submission. She wanted the court to understand that a prosecution would require her to publicly explain what it had felt like to have no door available to her but disappearance. And she would not, as she wrote, perform her worst years for anyone's entertainment. That phrase, that extraordinary phrase, she would not perform her worst years for anyone's entertainment. I have read a great many documents in the course of putting this story together, and I have not read another sentence that does more in 11 words. It is not the language of a victim claiming justice. It is not the language of a woman who has been broken by what was done to her. It is the language of someone who has, through 12 years of solitude and rebuilding, and the quiet daily work of constructing a self out of what remains when everything else is stripped away. It is the language of someone who has arrived at a place of extraordinary clarity about what she owes the world and what the world owes her. She owed it nothing, and she knew it, and she was not going to let the legal system or the newspapers or the estate or Edward Ashford's solicitors, none of them, turn her story into a spectacle. She was going to control what could be controlled, and she did. The legal outcome was, predictably, an anticlimax of the most English variety. The second marriage was annulled. Eleanor was reinstated in the official record as a living person. Catherine More Ashford was granted full rights to the financial assets she had accumulated during the marriage and was given a settlement that, while not publicly disclosed, was understood by those close to the proceedings to be substantial enough to ensure her comfort for the remainder of her life. Edward Ashford was never charged. Robert Croft, the solicitor who had signed the original death certificate, died in the spring of 1975, several months before the formal proceedings concluded, in thereby ensuring that the person most directly responsible for the document at the center of the case would never be required to explain himself in a court of law. The estate's legal team issued a brief statement acknowledging that an irregularity in the documentation of the first Duchess's status had come to light and had been corrected through the appropriate legal channels. And that, as far as the official record was concerned, was that. Edward Ashford died in 1979. He left the estate to a nephew, having produced no children with either of his wives. His obituary in the Times made no mention of Eleanor. It described him as having been twice married, which was, technically, the same number of times the law had chosen to recognize. Catherine More went on to live quietly and, by all accounts, she moved to the south of France in the early 1980s and did not speak publicly about the marriage or its unraveling at any point in the rest of her life. A single interview conducted by a French magazine in 1989, which has never been translated into English, reportedly contained her only public comment on the subject, which was this, that she had married a man who was already spoken for, by his own past, and that she had always sensed it, in the way that you sense a room is not quite level, not enough to name it, but enough to always feel slightly off balance when you were in it. That is all she said. She never spoke about it again. Eleanor Ashford died in the spring of 1981. She was buried in the churchyard of the small parish church near Marazion under the name Eleanor Gray, which was the name she had chosen for herself and which she had asked in a brief handwritten note left with her solicitor to be used on her grave. She was 79 years old. Her garden was still being tended, as of the time of the last available account. The cat, by then, had long since been replaced by another. The library where she was a familiar presence held a small memorial for her on the week following her death. Not advertised, not announced beyond the community, just an evening gathering of the people who had known her as Eleanor Gray for 12 years and who mourned in the specific and private way that small communities mourn their own, the loss of a woman they had never fully known. Her sister Margaret came down from Edinburgh. They had seen each other, it emerged, several times during the years of Eleanor's disappearance, visits conducted with the care and planning of something that needed to remain invisible. Margaret did not speak to reporters. She never had. The final piece of the story, the piece that I have been carrying since the moment I first came across it in an archive box in a Bristol records office in the course of researching an entirely different subject, was not discovered until 2003, 22 years after Eleanor's death, 28 years after the legal proceedings, 24 years after Edward Ashford's death. It was a letter, a single letter, written by Eleanor to Edward in the autumn of 1959. 3 years before her official disappearance, 3 years before the death certificate, 3 years before the hotel register and the trust in the coastal house in Marazion. When the letter was found folded inside a copy of a Keats collection that had been packed, along with the rest of the estate's library, into storage following the transfer of the property to the nephew. The nephew had never opened the boxes. No one had. The researcher who found it was cataloging the library for a county heritage project and nearly set it aside unread. Nearly. The letter was 4 pages long. It was written in the clear, precise handwriting that was recognizable from Eleanor's other correspondence. And what it contained? What Eleanor Grace Ashford had written to her husband in the autumn of 1959, 2 years after her diagnosis, in full knowledge of the prognosis and the likely shape of the years ahead, was not what anyone expected. She was not writing to accuse him. She was not writing to grieve. She was writing to propose. Eleanor Ashford had written to Edward with a plan. Her plan. She had been given, in the most optimistic reading, perhaps 2 to 3 years to live. She did not want to spend those years, however many there were, as the invalid duchess of an estate she had never entirely felt was hers, managed by a man who had been retreating behind his walls for years, performing the role of dying wife for an audience that had never quite accepted her in the first place. She wanted something else. She wanted out, and she understood, with the cold, clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had watched Edward operate long enough to know how his mind worked, that the only way out available to her was if Edward wanted out too, and she knew he did. She had known about Catherine Moore for months. She did not say so explicitly in the letter, but the shape of what she wrote made it clear that she understood what was happening and had made her own calculation about it. She proposed, in language that was careful but unmistakable, that her death be formally arranged, that she disappear, that the estate's trust structure be used to provide her with an income sufficient to live simply but comfortably somewhere private, far from the estate and its demands, that Edward be free to remarry, and that in exchange for her cooperation, the arrangement be maintained quietly and permanently. She asked for one specific thing in return beyond the financial provision, that her sister Margaret be told the truth and be permitted to visit her. She asked for nothing else. Not acknowledgement, not credit, not justice, just privacy and money enough to live, and the company of the one person in the world she trusted completely. She ended the letter, and this is the sentence I keep coming back to, the sentence that I think contains the whole of the story in 11 words. She ended the letter with this: I did not choose this illness, but I will choose what follows. I will choose what follows. She did. She chose Marazion and watercolors and a library and a garden and 12 years of a life that was, by every available account, more genuinely hers than anything that had come before it. She outlived her prognosis by more than a decade. She outlived Edward. She outlived the scandal. She outlived the proceedings and the legal arguments and the newspaper silence and the institutional evasions. She outlived all of it, and she died in the spring of 1981 under the name she had chosen, in the town she had chosen, having arranged everything, to borrow a word, exactly as she intended. So who in the end is the villain of this story? Who do you hold responsible? Is it Edward Ashford, who falsified a death certificate and married a woman who did not know his first wife was alive? Is it Robert Croft, the solicitor who put his name on a document he knew to be fraudulent and spent 15 years maintaining a secret that was not his to keep? Is it the system, the aristocratic, institutional, deeply English system that surrounded all of them and made the arrangement possible, and then, when it was discovered, responded with annulment papers and quiet settlements rather than accountability? Or is the answer more uncomfortable than any of those? Is it possible that the only person in this entire story who got what she actually wanted, who ended her life, having lived on her own terms, in a place she had chosen, doing the things she had chosen, is it possible that that person was Eleanor? And does that change what you think about what was done to her, or what she chose? I have been thinking about those questions since the afternoon I first read that letter in the Bristol archive. I have not arrived at clean answers. I am not sure clean answers exist. What I believe, what I keep coming back to, is that this story is not really about a duke or a death certificate or a bigamous marriage. It is about what happens to people when the structures built to protect them offer them no real protection at all. When a woman has no door available to her but disappearance. When a man has been so thoroughly trained in the management of appearances that he cannot find the courage for honesty, even when honesty might have been the only thing that could have saved him. When a system that is very good at looking after itself looks after itself one more time and calls it resolution. Those are not small questions. They are not questions that belong only to 1962 or 1974 or the particular world of an English estate and its dukedom. They are questions about power and privacy and what it costs a person to survive inside a structure that was not built with them in mind. And they have not stopped being relevant, not even slightly. That is the story of Edward Harlan Ashford, the Duke of Carleton, and his first marriage and his second, and the woman who arranged her own disappearance and lived, for 12 astonishing years, exactly the life she had chosen for herself. I'm glad you stayed to the end. I told you it was worth it. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this genuinely. I read every single comment that comes in on these videos. Who do you hold responsible? One name? One reason? Drop it in the comments right now and let's talk about it. And if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself turning it over, unable to quite set it down, then subscribe, because the next story is already in production, and it is going to take everything you think you know about loyalty and deception and the way powerful institutions bury inconvenient people, and it is going to turn it completely inside out. I'll see you then.